with Stephen, and it was a fantastic trip. It was one of the best I've ever gone on. We had a really interesting guide who kind of walked off to the side, and Dr. Steve took over and told us everything about every site that you can imagine. And one of them is what he's talking about tonight, Masada. And that was, if you've never been there, you should go there. If no other reason to go to Israel, go to Masada, because it is really fantastic. But if you get a chance, and Dr. Stephen puts on another trip, which he's talking about maybe doing, I would strongly recommend you sign up doing that with his trip, because it was fantastic. Well, let's see here. Dr. Stephen Derfler. He's Executive Director of Education Resources Incorporated. He's an international educational consultant, public speaker, archaeologist, historian, researcher, teacher, and writer. Dr. Derfler has been uncovering histories of ancient civilizations for 40 years, tracing the development of Western religions from their roots in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean countries. Dr. Derfler brings insight to current political and social events, bridging the past with the future to promote greater understanding between people from different faiths and walks of life. Dr. Derfler.
How many of you have ever actually gotten your hands dirty? On an archaeological site? Okay, all right. Well, then you are aware, and those of you who haven't, consider yourselves sort of lucky, because archaeology is the herpes of the scientific world, because once you get it, it's in your blood forever, right? Oh, come on, that was funny. It's already a tough crowd. I'm a very funny person. If you don't think so, it's your problem. It's not mine, all right? I've been involved in 8 major excavations in Israel. This past September was my 52nd trip to Israel. I've also been the the American director of 2 projects during the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. And I will try not to bore you with a couple of main elements of King Herod's monolith, the archaeological site of Masada, because I have had the honor and the privilege to direct restoration and salvage excavation there for a number of years. And the current director of Masada is a friend of mine for 45 years, and he's like a brother to me. Herod's mountaintop monolith, by the way, this is my security blanket, this handpick. It's been with me since I stole it from the Beersheba excavations in 1971. I know what you're thinking. I started when I was only 5 years old, right? Okay. All right. We're going to be focusing on the 2 great palaces of King Herod at the site of Masada, a northern palace and a western palace. But first, we have to lay the groundwork. According to the ancient historian Josephus Flavius, a general of the first Jewish revolt that began in the year 66 and culminated with the conquest of Masada in the year 73 of this era, he states that the high priest of ancient Judea, a priest by the name of Yonatan, built a fortress overlooking the Dead Sea, and he simply called it Metzudah, which in Hebrew means fortress. So Masada simply means fortress. It is located just opposite the Lisan, a tongue of land that pretty much divides the Dead Sea into 2 pieces. 2/3 to the north and 1/3 to the south. A spit of land that extends from Jordan, extending to the west into the Dead Sea. Here you can see in these aerial views that Masada is a mountaintop monolith that is detached from the rest of the Judean desert mountains. In other words, it makes it almost impregnable. And if you are situated there, You can hear the footsteps, and you can see the cloud of dust from enemy armies approaching from miles away, such as you see here. From the north and slightly to the east, you can see Masada in the background, and that is 10 kilometers, 6 miles away as the crow flies. And you can see a pen and ink done by Tipping in 1851 of the monolith from approximately the same kind of location. These aerial views were taken by the Israeli Air Force. Some of them, there are a couple that I've been fortunate enough to be in an ultralight with a friend. Don't ever go in an ultralight in the Judean desert, because when they tip the wings, you could make your mark on the Judean desert floor 150 feet below you, if you know what I mean. Here you can see a view of the mountaintop monolith from the northwest in these images. You can see the plateau that rises on the eastern side, on the western side, and then the drop to the Dead Sea Valley far to the east. Now, when we look at Masada, it is going to be a couple of 100 feet above sea level on the summit. But the Dead Sea Valley below is 1,360 feet below sea level. So for the next 45 minutes to an hour, you'll have to hold your breath, right? And here are other views as well. You can see that it is completely isolated, but then you notice this white ramp here and here or here. You have to disregard that in terms of the natural geography, because that ramp was created by the Romans in the spring and summer of the year 73 when they lay siege to the site. So that is an artificially created Roman ramp that would host a siege tower and a battering ram that would allow the Romans to breach the walls of this fortress after a several-month-long siege. It rises over 100 meters above the western plateau, and as I said, 1,300 feet, 400 meters to the Dead Sea Valley floor. It's a rhomboid, and it's 600 meters from north to south, 1,800 to 1,900 feet. And then it's only a mere 900 feet at its widest point, east to west. And this is a view of Masada then on the right at sunset. The only way that you can easily access Masada naturally is by a very narrow, twisting path that leads from the Dead Sea side to the summit. And it is aptly called a snake path. It takes about 45 minutes to climb, but if you're in a hurry, you can go down it in about 12 minutes. And here then you can see the snake path as it ascends to the summit, or as it ascends here as well. The very first exploration of the site of Masada came in 1867 by Captain Charles Warren of the Palestine Exploration Fund. And we have a saying in the Middle East, blame it on the British. And when it comes to archaeology, and the earliest archaeologists to explore, and the earliest pilgrims and adventurers to examine many archaeological sites and identify them, it would be up to the British in the middle of the 19th century. The very first plans for the site would be drawn by Claude Condor, a Frenchman, on the heels of the British in 1875, after he visited the summit. The site of Masada, although abandoned after the 8th century of this era, would prove to be an extraordinarily easy excavation because, as you can see in this photograph on the right, taken in 1960, prior to excavation, you pretty much only had to do a little light dusting and vacuuming to have the archaeological site revealed. And the reason is that once the site had been destroyed by the Romans and occupied by the 15th and the 10th Roman legions for a very short period of time with a small garrison, and then a handful of Byzantine monks lived there from the 5th to the 8th century of this era, the site being abandoned was never fully covered over by the sands of time. So the outline of all of the major structures, the walls simply crumbled in place. And that meant that it was a very easy excavation because it wasn't a clean palette on the summit of this mountain. The excavations took place under the auspices of the Hebrew University and the Department of Antiquities. The chairman of the Department of Archaeology of Hebrew University at that time was Yigal Yadin, the gentleman that you see on the left. And he would then direct the landmark excavations at Masada. And I say this because this was the first excavation to make use of slave labor, volunteers from around the world. Prior to the 1960s, archaeological research was carried out mainly by employing local laborers who could care less about archaeology, about archaeological methods and techniques. They were technicians. They could dig, and that was it. They could care less what they were examining, what they were discovering, and what they were going to analyze. That would be left up to the archaeologists and their graduate students. But archaeology is an expensive business. It takes an awful lot of money to carry out an excavation. As a result, the notion of the archaeological field school comes about in the 1960s. And this would be the seminal site that would test that theory. Would everyday people like you pay hard-earned cash to go and become slave laborers on an excavation, working from 5:30 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon, sleeping in tents? In the publicity, they called them portable, movable structures, not tents. As you can see in these two photographs from the excavations. And the answer is yes. People from all over the world, and as a result, Masada became almost a year-round project, which is unheard of in the archaeological world, because if you've got students and volunteers and faculty from universities, then you can only do it when you have vacations, which pretty much is in the summer months or during winter break. But now you have the opportunity to work year-round. And over 5,000 volunteers from all corners of the world. And you thought the world was round, didn't you? Would take part in this project. And in 2013 in London, they had a class reunion. And they had about 250 people out of those 5,000 all come to London for a week, for conferences, to reminisce, to schmooze with each other, to meet with each other, and to say, boy, your hair was a lot darker back then. A tribute to those people who took part in this extraordinary project. Again, the only natural approach to the summit of Masada is through this very, very twisting and turning snake path that rises to the summit of the mountain. At some places, it is only wide enough for one person at a time to ascend. Because on one side, you've got the mountain rising hundreds of feet above you. And on the other side, it's Goodnight Irene down to the Dead Sea Valley. So a handful of soldiers at the top of the mountain and at the top of the snake path could hold off thousands of enemies because they could only approach one or two people wide at a time. It was the ideal place for refuge and for safety and security. Josephus Flavius 2,000 years ago would say, and one of the ways is called the serpent, as resembling that animal in its narrowness and perpetual windings. And he that would walk along it must first go on one leg and then the other. There is also nothing but destruction in case your feet slip. For on each side there is a vastly deep chasm and precipice, sufficient to quell the courage of everybody by the terror it infuses into the mind. Today, there is a cable car, which makes it a bit easier. But I remember the good old days before the first cable car was built in 1974. 2,000 years later, Yigal Yadin himself would say, a steep, narrow trail called the Snake's Path winds its way to the top. When you reach the barren summit and look out in the burning bright sunlight, you are overwhelmed by the loneliness of the place. It is formidable, a formidable sight cut off on all sides by steep valleys. It's truly a phenomenal location and setting. At the top of the snake path, you find one of the original gates that stood on the summit. There were 4 gates that breached the walls on the summit. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But the one opposite the snake path was called, guess what? The snake path gate. It was a single room. It was lined with benches. The benches and the walls were coated with white limestone plaster. And the plaster panels on the walls were decorated in patterns that resembled marble slabs adhering to the wall face. A square stone slab paved floor rounded out this guard room. Today it has been restored and reconstructed by the National Parks Authority of Israel. And if you look real carefully inside the guard room, you can see a black line right there. Everywhere you go in Israel, and everywhere you go throughout the Middle East, there will be a black, a gray, or a beige line that signifies the difference between the original and restoration and reconstruction. And the main reason for that is because we don't want to pull the socks over your eyes. We're not trying to fool you about what was discovered and what was preserved. But for those of you who have ever walked around an archaeological site that's more than just a midden heap or a couple of ash pits or fire pits, you know that if you walk from one room to the next and you can walk over the remains of a wall that's only about 18 inches high, you don't get the perspective of what the ancient buildings were like. So we as archaeologists raise the walls a bit to force you to go in and out of the rooms that then give you a sense of what the ancient rooms and the ancient buildings were like. But we're not trying to fool you. And as a result, you can see then the black kind of line that's there. King Herod was paranoid. He thought that only 9 out of every 8 people was trying to kill him. And he was pretty much right. He was so paranoid. Now you're supposed to say, how paranoid was he?
How paranoid was he?
Thank you. I hate it that I have to. Okay. You can hold up a sign that says, plot now or something. Okay. He had his wife and 2 of his sons killed, and the rest of his sons imprisoned. Look at this monolith. Look at this mountaintop fortress. You don't think that's secure? Well, to Herod it wasn't, because he then built a solid outer and inner wall called a casemate wall. One wall inside the other. 1,400 meters around the summit. Even though nobody could get up to 1,300 out of the 1,400 meters of wall. Easily. 30 towers also ringed the perimeter. You go to Wikipedia today, and under paranoia, you see a picture of King Herod. It's just that easy. A casemate is an inner and outer fortification wall that has rooms built into it that serve for storage. There were 70 of these casemates that ran around the 1,400 meters of the perimeter. There then was a ceiling that had a parapet on top, and this is where the soldiers would keep watch. Today, most of the outer wall of the casemate has collapsed over the edge of the mountain, as you can see right here. These are the separating walls that are called casemates for the individual rooms. This is the preserved inner wall. In this portion here, you've got a portion of the outer wall and the inner wall beautifully preserved today. And there are many places around the summit of Masada that have signs that say, passage forbidden, because if you take a step beyond, it can be extraordinarily dangerous. Of the 5,000 people that worked there, Tragically, only one volunteer, well, it wasn't tragically only one. Tragically, one volunteer. That's what I kept saying about the group of people I took to Israel. Tragically, I brought them all back. One person tragically lost his life working on the summit because the safety rope that was looped around his waist and attached on top of the mound parted and gave way, and he fell to his death. But that meant that almost 5,000 people were given proper safety procedures that were put in place. And it was an extremely safe excavation with that one horrific exception. Water is life. And as a result, if you can't bring bottled water up to Masada, then there's no way that you're going to survive there. The Dead Sea gets virtually zero, zip, nada, shum davar in Hebrew, water, by the time it gets to the Dead Sea Valley. But during the winter months, which are the rainy months in Israel, end of December, January, February, and early March, the summit of Masada is so high in elevation, again, a couple of 100 feet above sea level, that you can get rainfall on the summit. And I've been fortunate enough to see that. The ground is very fertile on the summit of Masada. And all you have to do is add water, and you can grow crops for pasturage. You can grow fruits and vegetables if you need to. And as a result, Herod's engineers understood the geology, the geography, and the climatology of the site of Masada, and ran a number of aqueducts around the summit of the site. These would lead then to beautifully rock-cut cisterns that were plastered. So as much water as possible that fell from the skies during the winter months could be gathered and could be stored. In February of one year, and I don't remember what year, I was fortunate enough to be on top of Masada when it did rain. And you can see one of the aqueducts on the far left picture, flooded with water. Unfortunately, because the aqueducts have been broken over the past 2,000 years, the water cascades over the side of the mountain into the wadi below, and the water is pretty much lost. But within a couple of days, I was back on top of the summit of Masada and look at that beautiful red flower. For a few days every year after those initial rains, the summit of Masada is a carpet of flowers, wild flowers that grow up there. So it is an extraordinarily easy place to live as long as you've got water. And to prove that point, one of the largest cisterns ever to be excavated in ancient Israel can be found towards the southern end of the summit. You can't miss it because there's this big gray arrow on the ground. Okay? It's beautifully rock cut out of the red Nubian sandstones and limestones. And here you can see the descent into this water cistern. Oops, what did I do there? Sorry, I hit the wrong button.
Yeah,
How do I get back to the...
I'll get it. Hold on.
Okay. That's what happens when you use somebody else's clicker. Go to...
Full screen mode.
Oh, no, okay, there we go, thank you. And I'll try to keep hitting the right button. Here you can see it on the inside then as you descend into the heart of the mountain. It is a stunningly beautiful rock-cut cistern with much of the original plaster still adhering to the surface of the walls. The water aqueduct that we saw in the previous slide, and I'm not going to go back because I'm afraid I hit the wrong button, originally entered into the cistern in this very beautifully square rock-cut opening. Over the past 2,000 years, this hole that you see here, this uneven hole there was a fault in the natural bedrock, and as a result, there was a ceiling collapse. So please disregard this hole, and this then is the entrance that filled the cistern in antiquity. But the hole in the wall of the cistern gives you one of those great Kodak moments, don't you think? Yeah. Here you can see it from the opposite side now, from the floor of the cistern, and the beautifully rock-cut steps that then ascend up and out the cistern itself. Tens of thousands of gallons of water. And there was no Jack and Jill syndrome here. You went down the flight of steps as the water level dropped from usage. You didn't lower a bucket down. So you traced the water and you followed the water down. And then this is the view once you get back outside on the way up and out. And it's really not that difficult because there are some people here that did it. And they are still talking and living, etc. Herod constructed 2 palaces. He constructed a public palace that was used for his guests and visitors, and then he constructed another palace that was his private residence and also his castle keep, just in case somebody should breach the walls and attack the son of Masada. The Western Palace that you can see right here has been beautifully restored and reconstructed. And it's the largest residential building on the site itself. This is where guests and visitors would come, and he would greet them and meet them. But he would provide them with all of the luxuries that they may be used to. And this is the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of King Herod himself. Do you recognize that guy?
Yeah.
He looks familiar, huh? Okay. He's one of your vice presidents, right? I had to throw that in, or you said he would disown me. All right. Now, again, according to King Herod, this Western palace would be opulent, it would be luxurious, but then it would never be reused after. It shows you very clearly that all of the rooms were delineated. So you didn't need to really set up a grid system because it was a clean slate and you worked in 5 by 5 meter squares. Do you follow me? You could excavate each and every one of the rooms as a separate locus, as a separate 3-dimensional figure. The palace itself covered 4,000 square meters. Can you imagine the property taxes in Sarasota County if you had a 4,000 square meter? The entry to the palace was of roughly hewn limestone blocks, but then everything was plastered over. Here you can see one of the original excavation photos. And now we get a glimpse of, no matter how wealthy King Herod was, and no matter how much he was part and parcel of the greater Roman world of the Mediterranean, he was also a cheapskate. He tried to cut corners. And he utilized the Roman illusionary style of art, which meant that plastered panels were then frescoed to look like beautiful panels of marble with veining on them from a distance. But when you get closer, it's nothing more than painted plaster. We will see other examples of that in just a minute. This is the way that the entrance into the palace complex looks today. There were storerooms that surrounded an open-air courtyard, a throne room, and a bathhouse. And no, that's not redundant. Throne room. Opposite the central courtyard that we see here was another room that would serve as the guest auditorium the reception hall, if you will. And you can see that it was separated from the rest of the courtyard with two beautiful columns, but these were drum columns that were plastered over, and then the plaster was made to look like these were monolithic marble columns. Josephus Flavius, the historian who wrote about the siege and the fall of Masada, never actually got onto the site because he describes the beautiful white gleaming marble of the palaces, so he only saw it truly from a distance. But it's the bathhouse that's extraordinary in this Western palace. And here you can see it as excavated between 63 and 65. It was a typical, traditional Roman-style bathhouse with your changing room, with your cold room, your warm room, and your hot room, and I guess those are all relative terms when you're in the Judean desert overlooking the Dead Sea. Cold has an entirely relative different meaning to it. And here we can see it immediately following the excavation in 1965. But what is stunning to see are the absolutely phenomenal mosaic floors of this bathhouse, showing you the opulence, showing you the luxury that King Herod expected not just for his guests, but also for his family as well. And today, the National Parks Authority has built a skyway system on a second floor level that allows you to walk over all of these bathhouse chambers and look down on the mosaic floors, the various mosaic floors, as you can see here in these images. This bathhouse, though, would also be reused by the Zealots 100 years later when the population of the mountain exploded from roughly 100 to 1,000 during the revolt against Rome. And when you've got that many people, you have to remodel and you have to adapt. So try to disregard, if you can, these two small, crude stone and plastered basins on the floor of this chamber, because those were built by the Zealots 100 years later. They were not part of King Herod's bathhouse complex. But here you can even see you had a built-in tub. No, there were no jets. It was not a jacuzzi. But you can see this beautiful stone and plastered tub set into this small alcove right here. Isn't that incredible? Here you can see that, again, in the changing room, the mosaics were all then very much aware of the Jewish constituents of King Herod and the fact that King Herod himself was half Jewish, and so some of his family members practiced the faith, which meant that you didn't have the traditional Roman mosaics that had graven images on them according to the biblical narrative. So you have everything in geometric and floral patterns, such as you see on these mosaic floors here. And again, you can see evidence of the two different occupation phases with these crudely built bathtubs. In the changing room, one of the changing rooms, you have this stunningly beautiful Grecian wave motif, the egg and dart motif, and a beautiful rosette panel in the center. I was fortunate enough to be asked to direct maybe that's not so fortunate, to do the annual spring cleaning, once every 2,000 years, of the mosaic floors in the bathhouse. And I had to throw this in, that's my daughter, cleaning that mosaic floor. And every time I mention it to her, she says, "Yeah, I know, Dad, you keep saying that was the only floor I've ever cleaned in my life." But over 2,000 years, these mosaic floors had built up a calcium carbonate encrustation on them, and just a very subtle use of an acid solution. In this case, so subtle we used lemon juice, citric acid. And it removed all of the encrustation, and the colors then jumped out at you as if they had just been laid, not 2,000 years old. This is his western palace, and this is the one for his guests now. But the northern palace is one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world. And I've got to tell you that it should have been on that second list of the 7 wonders of the world that the world voted on just in the past couple of years. Because this is not just an illusion, but this is truly a hanging palace that is suspended over the floor of the Dead Sea, 1,300 feet below you, in 3 different levels, descending down the northern cliff face, with the lowest level 140 feet below the summit or the Acropolis. And this is the way that it probably looked 2,000 years ago. It was such a monumental engineering undertaking that an 80-foot high retaining wall of block and bedrock was constructed beneath it to keep everything from falling down to the Dead Sea. 80 feet below the lowest level of the lowest terrace, right here. And more of King Herod's paranoia is truly evident because the northern palace here was completely isolated from the rest of the fortress by a beautiful white plastered and stone foundation wall. Sort of like the castle keep in a medieval castle. If you broke into the castle, the knights could always go into the castle keep as a secondary position of defense and protection. It also had its own cisterns, because if anybody got on top of the mountain in that unlikely event, Herod's northern palace still needed its own water source and water supply. So here you can see 2 smaller cisterns, and here you can see where the aqueduct then emptied into this cistern right here. Immediately outside this northern palace complex was a room that was called the commander's house. It probably was for the commander originally of King Herod's royal guard, his bodyguards. But then during the Jewish revolt against Rome 100 years later, it was most likely commandeered by Eleazar ben Yair, the zealot leader of the revolt, and used by him and his family until the site was destroyed in the year 73. Today, that building is entirely reconstructed and restored by the National Parks Authority. There were 2 blocks of storehouses as well, so that again, it wasn't just water, but if anybody broke onto the summit of Masada, Herod had his own Publix, complete with pantry. The northern block was made of 4 long rooms, 20 by 3.8 meters, and angled down the sides. And the southern block had 11 larger chambers as well. And here we can see clearly that Yigil Yadin, in his wisdom, decided that some of those storehouses would be excavated, yet others would be left as discovered, so that the goodies, the tinned goods, right? The freeze-dried Oreo cookies are still underneath the rubble, yet to be excavated, as you can see here. And Josephus makes it clear that the foodstuffs were in abundance and that the people on the summit of Masada during the revolt didn't perish because of a lack of food, water, or weapons. They chose to end their lives so that they would not taste of slavery, that they would die in dignity and in freedom, and that their children would not be subjected to unmentionable things. He said, "For here have been stored a mass of corn, amply sufficient to last for years, abundance of wine and oil, besides every variety of pulse, and piles of dates." He also said, that although from the date of storage to the capture of the place by the Romans, well nigh a century had elapsed, but the food was still good, amazingly enough. Herod wanted to have his own bathhouse in his northern palace, which was just for his family and immediate close friends. And so the bathhouse then has been excavated and preserved today. It is one of the most stunning examples of a complete Roman bathhouse complex. Here we can see a scale model of it. An outer courtyard fronted the bathhouse complex, surrounded by a peristyle. Because again, we're talking about a Judean desert Dead Sea sun that is a frigid 85 degrees during the winter, and maybe a mild 130 degrees during the middle of July. So there would be a portico surrounding the courtyard to protect you from the sun. And it was of stunningly beautiful, octagonally laid, geometric mosaic patterns. It had an apoditarium, the changing room. And it was beautifully designed and beautifully walled with stunning fresco. You all know the difference between fresco and wall painting, right? I take that as a resounding nuh-uh. Wall painting is painting on walls. Brought to you by the Department of Redundancy Department, okay? But fresco is wet plaster where the paint, the color is imbued in the plaster, sometimes to a depth of up to 1/4 of an inch. So if you were to lightly sandpaper a frescoed wall and get all of the dirt and the schmutz off of the surface, the colors will jump out at you. But if you were to sandpaper a painted wall, you're going to see sheetrock real quick. Do you follow me? Because it's only a thin coat of paint on it. But the wet, frescoed plaster is up to 1/4 of an inch thick. This is the way that it looked after 2,000 years. Okay, we'll go back here. 2,000 years, as seen from the photographs from the excavation in the Idaean. And this is the way that it looks today. The floor of this changing room was beautifully laid with stone tile, gray and white limestone tiles, and they were all triangular. The tiles had long since been robbed in antiquity, but the beautiful floor, the concrete base, shows you in the negative the outline of where the tiles would have been. Do you follow me? So you can still see that beautifully preserved. And the wall basin is another addition by the Roman zealots 100 years later. The frigidarium, the cold room, was actually just a small chamber that had a flight of stairs leading down to a relatively cold pool of water. And that's a relative term, right? So here that is. From there, you walk through the warm room, which is the tepidarium, until finally you then approach the caldarium, also known as the hypocaust, which is the hot room. And it had a wall surrounding it that was over 3 feet thick for insulating purposes to keep the heat inside the caldarium. And so now, as you can see, you are walking from the warm room through the archway into the hot room. And this is one of the most beautifully preserved of the caldaria found in any Roman bath in the Eastern Mediterranean. It had a false floor. The floor was made of plaster that was up to 10 centimeters, which is about 4.5 inches thick. And it rested on small pillars made out of stone. Steam was forced under the floor. The floor itself had pinholes in it where the steam wafted up. but it also had a unique piping system that allowed the steam then to gently waft down on you from the vaulted ceiling above. And found in the corner, you can see the original stone wall of the exterior and then excavated ceramic pipes, Roman ceramic pipe with the false plastered interior wall, floor, and corner of the room, because then the steam circulated up and rose gently in all of these pipes. They then allowed it to then waft gently on you. It must have been delightful. Of course, all you needed to do was walk outside and get the same feeling, right? Today it has been restored and reconstructed by the Department of Antiquity that supported the false floor. Here you can see a wooden walkway that is on the level of where the floor should have been. Here you can see the black line of reconstruction and preservation. Everything below that is original, but you can see that the spring of the vault is still preserved at the base, so we know how the vault originally was constructed. And then below, you have the flue hole where the steam would be forced with a foot bellows underneath the floor. And we'll show you that in just a second. Here then is the reconstructed corner that we worked on in 2001, showing you these ceramic pipes that then ran almost to the vault at the ceiling, where the steam would be forced up. Hot air rises, you know, and then it would waft down gently on you. Also then in 2000 and 2001, they reconstructed the Pryfernium, the furnace that was just outside of the bathhouse. This is where wood then would be lit to burn and heat up rocks. Water would be dumped on it in this vaulted chamber here, and then a couple of servants with foot bellows would force the steam into the pipes and under the floor for the pleasure and the comfort of Herod and his family. The three-level palace, then, was also one that showed us about the paranoia of King Herod, because the three levels were connected by a hidden staircase carved into the face of the mountain, so that you couldn't see people from a distance going between each of the levels. I mean, that's paranoia, folks. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sorry, but it's paranoia. The upper terrace had two main parts: an apartment complex with a couple of beautiful rooms that were roofed over, and then a semicircular terrace that gave you a stunning view of the Dead Sea Valley and the Dead Sea proper. Here you can see the hidden staircase that was cleared and excavated by Yadin between 63 and 65. 20 meters below the top level was a circular terrace. That's 65 feet or so, as you can see right here. It was an engineering marvel as well. It had an inner and outer retaining wall beneath the floor of this terrace, designed to relieve pressure from one wall to the next, so the whole thing wouldn't collapse under your feet and down 1,300 feet to the floor of the Dead Sea. And it is constantly being monitored, and it has been closed for a couple of years while the National Parks Authority has begun the process of tuck pointing and reconstructing some of these walls because of minor shifting and movement that has forced some of the stones to come loose over the past few years. But here from the top then, you can see the inner and outer concentric walls. I mean, this is amazing. Remember I talked about the heat? And I talked about how nasty it is? Well, if you've got water and you've got shade, the Northern Palace is a splendid place to hang out. Why? because it sticks out like the prow of a boat. And the wind blows and hits you from over 195 degrees of points on the compass. Which means that even if the wind is shifting, within that 195-degree arc, you're still getting a breeze because you're sticking out so far. And it's absolutely a delightful place. I know there's some people in the second row that would disagree with me, because I had them out there in the hot sun. It can be extraordinarily delightful. And to top it all off, to show you the way that the wind is constantly shifting, Josephus quotes Rubius Gallus. And whether he really said this or not, I'm not sure. It was one of those 8 gazillion emails from Josephus Flavius. Okay. Rubius Gallus said that the wind at the summit of Masada is as fickle as a Phrygian whore. That's a direct quote. I didn't say that, so I'm not cursing or anything. But it shows you how delightful it can be on the summit if you've got water and you've got shade, because you have got fans blowing constantly, natural fans. Once again, there's a hidden staircase that leads from the middle terrace down to the lowest one. And this lower terrace is 15 meters, 45, 48 feet below the second terrace, and it is above that massive retaining wall. It is a rectangular platform that has a square, open courtyard in the middle of it, surrounded by a peristyle. And once again, it shows us the Roman illusionary style of art, because from a distance, all of these panels look like they could be beautifully polished, grained marble panels. And I'm saying from a distance, which means that Josephus didn't see these painted panels. And that is sort of like a chair rail and wainscoting running around the base. And this is the way that it probably looked like in antiquity. A stunningly beautiful lower level. But again now, consider this. If you are on the lowest level, you're going to go up 130 feet to go use the bathhouse on the summit? I don't think so. So, Herod actually had constructed, we'll get to there in a second, a very small bathhouse. I guess you could call it a guest bath, a half bath, you know, so that you didn't have to go up and down. Here you can see the beautiful drum columns that, when plastered over, looked like monolithic marble columns. But then in the corner, it had heart-shaped columns, which meant that it was aesthetically and geometrically balanced. Because you know that the Greco-Roman world was very much involved in symmetry and balance. 6x9, 3x4, you know, these kind of geometric balances. So what happens when you get to if you have a 6x9 series of columns, one direction and the other, you have 2 columns smooshed together in the corner? No. You have a heart-shaped column that can be counted in both directions, but a single column. And this is what Herod did. Here then is that lower level bathhouse. Again, it is a similar bathhouse, but much smaller in size. I'm hoping that they had a pocket door, you know, because there's absolutely no room. And because it was abandoned 2,000 years ago, and it was built so close to the edge of this northern tier, half of it collapsed over the edge after it was abandoned. And today, nobody can even go down there to look at it because it is so unstable. And then here you can see, from a side view, the 3 levels of that northern palace. A wonder of the ancient world, clearly. This is what it looks like from a helicopter now, and this is probably what it looked like 2,000 years ago, with the lower rectangular terrace, the middle circular terrace, and then the nice circular upper terrace. But again, 100 years later, 1,000 zealots fled from Jerusalem to try to survive along the shore of the Dead Sea as the last remaining vestige of that revolt against Rome that began in the year 66. And because of that, once again, you multiply times 10 the number of people living up there, and you need more bathing facilities, you need more rooms for living, smaller apartments, so the place would be subdivided, as you can see here with these small bathtubs. But then again, the story of that revolt didn't escape the eyes of Hollywood. In 1984, they made a mini-series that was over 8 hours long, and then they shrunk it down to a 2-hour and 20-minute movie. It starred Peter O'Toole, Peter Strauss, Barbara Carrera, Anthony Quayle, and hundreds of us from the town of Arad. I was one of the archaeological advisors of the movie. They still didn't get things right, but that's okay. This is the set. It's amazing how an 1,800-foot long mountaintop monolith was compressed into 180 feet of styrofoam and wooden framework. But this is what they did. And then these are the props, including the ballistas and the base of the enormous siege tower that was constructed for the movie. See, I was there. Here you can see the siege tower, the filming of the movie, and if you look very carefully, the 5th Roman soldier from the right, I mean, you know, you can tell by the legs, right? An entire complex dedicated to Masada at the base of the mountain. A museum, a theater, yeah, there's a gift shop, and a snack bar. The director of Masada is Eitan Campbell, the guy that you see there, and he met our group and spoke to the group. Here he met the group in 2013 when I took another group. I've known him since 1973. We were a lot younger and less gray back then. But this is a stunningly beautiful museum now dedicated to the memory of Yigal Yadin, one of the 2 preeminent excavators in Israel. Scores of artifacts are found, a short video. All of this enhances the experience. And prior to 2007, all of the artifacts from Masada were in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, but the objects now have been brought back to the site. And here are just some of the hundreds of objects that were excavated during those 3 years, year-round years. Can we turn up the light for just a second? And in conclusion, I did bring you a couple of toys to take a look. First of all, thousands and thousands of ballistas were part of the Zealot armory and the Roman armory as well. And after 2,000 years, they still work. So be careful. And no, this is not the very first fastball that Nolan Ryan threw. This is a ballista from Masada. Hundreds of Roman oil lamps dated to the 1st century also were discovered in the debris and the ruins of the site of Masada, such as this one. But this site is very dear and near to me, because, can I tell a little short story? Okay, thanks. The first time I went to Israel, my parents said to me, how would you like an early graduation present from high school? And the first thing that went through my mind was, 69 fastback Mustang. And my father says to me, how would you like a trip to Israel? And I blurted out, what happened to the car? And my parents looked at me, what car? Well, now I have to be very careful when I say this, but back then, you know, anytime you can get out of high school and the principal lets you, you know, for 2 weeks, you take it, right? But I knew I was in trouble when we got to the airport, and it was a synagogue group, and my father was taking me. I knew I was in trouble when the second youngest person on the tour was my father. See why I have to be careful? Because now we're all of that age, right? Okay. But back then, when you're 17 years old and your father is the next youngest person to you in the group, you didn't talk to your parents when you were in high school, did you? No, none of us did. We might have left a note every once in a while, but we never talked to them. So the guide knew I was having a miserable time. And we get to Masada, and I didn't know Masada from beans. And he hands me this rock, and he says, "See me at dinner." Yeah, whatever. So after dinner, we go over to the sink, and we rinse it off. And it was the spout of a 2,000-year-old Herodian Roman oil lamp from Masada. 20 years later, we go full circle, and I was the director of a project that excavated 17 complete Roman oil lamps. So from that point on during that trip, I could care less who was also in the group. Kind of the way all these guys who went to Israel with me, they could care less who was directing the program, right? Because my eyes were always down to the ground. And I could care less about the people that were surrounding me.